Thank you for being here. What I'm about to present challenges some fundamental assumptions in biblical scholarship, but it does so using established intelligence analysis methodology. In that sense, it's a multidisciplinary approach, similar to other research projects that apply modern analytic tools to ancient sources. I'm a police detective and security analyst with almost 20 years of investigative experience, and over the past several months, I've applied counterintelligence frameworks to what may be the most consequential historical case we have: the origins of Christianity and the man we call Paul. This presentation is called Following the Evidence, because that's exactly what we're going to do. Follow patterns in the earliest sources, without letting later narratives tell us what to think. Let me give you the entire framework up front, then we'll unpack each piece. In 49 CE, the Roman historian Suetonius records that Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome because of riots at the instigation of Chrestus. Large numbers of Jews were displaced. Scholarship does not know where they went, but they didn't disappear. A practical reconstruction using law enforcement logic, and the logic these expelled Jews themselves would likely have followed, suggests they traveled to diaspora cities via well-established maritime routes from Rome's port at Ostia. Around the same time, in 51 CE, a man named Paulos, a man who has a background as a persecutor, begins writing letters to Jewish communities in those exact same cities. He talks about a new pacifist kind of Christos, or Chrestus. For 8 years, from 51 to 58 CE, Paul systematically visits these locations, accompanied by helpers with distinctly Roman names such as Gaius, Tertius, and Titus. He writes until the Jews are allowed to return to Rome. Then, silence. No more letters. And he himself moves to Rome as well, if we can believe Acts. We have 3 independent patterns here: geographic, chronologic, and strategic. Each one alone is suggestive. All 3 together is diagnostic. The intelligence operation hypothesis, which I've talked about extensively in earlier work, such as the peer-reviewed article titled Operation Messiah, and a book co-authored with military historian and Roman intelligence expert Colonel Rosemary Sheldon of VMI, explains all 3 with a single coherent framework. In 49 CE, Emperor Claudius expelled Jews from Rome due to disturbances at the instigation of Chrestus, according to Suetonius. Rather than assuming this refers to early Christians, a group for which we have no clear evidence in Rome at this time, we should note what's certain. The Chrestus message was associated with Jews. Greek-speaking Jews would naturally use Christos, or Christus, as the Greek translation of Messiah, meaning a liberator king appointed by God. In the Jewish context, this concept carried powerful political implications that could easily trigger the kind of rioting Suetonius describes. The disturbances could have been led by an actual man using this title inspired by someone's legacy in the name of Christus, or driven by the messianic concept itself as a rallying cry for resistance against Roman rule. This pattern of messianic unrest wasn't isolated to Rome. Similar disturbances had been erupting throughout Judea for years, often centered around figures claiming messianic authority and challenging Roman control. Claudius's response was to remove the source of instability by expelling the Jewish population, scattering them across the Mediterranean, where they would carry these same messianic ideas and grievances to new locations. This framework treats the evidence at face value, rather than retrofitting it to accommodate later Christian narratives. Here's where Rome's solution became Rome's problem. The expulsion transformed a contained threat in the capital into a distributed network across multiple cities. Think about it from a Roman security perspective. You had large numbers of people, already agitated by messianic ideas, now dispersed to diaspora Jewish communities throughout the empire. Expulsions don't solve coordination problems, they create them. Displaced populations don't disappear. They concentrate in predictable locations where they have existing support networks. And Rome was a security state, we have extensive documentation of Roman intelligence capabilities, their use of informants, their systematic approach to monitoring potential threats, and their use of propaganda. They didn't just expel people and forget about them. The question is, what did they do next? This is where scholarship has a gap. We have extensive documentation about Roman expulsions, but virtually no systematic study of where expelled populations actually went. So we applied basic logistics. What did expelled Jews need? Existing Jewish communities for support, synagogues for religious continuity. What routes were available? Maritime trade routes from Rome's port at Ostia. This map shows Roman maritime infrastructure around 49 CE. The ports, the shipping routes, the major coastal cities. These weren't random destinations. They were the obvious, accessible locations for anyone leaving Rome by sea. Notice the concentration of ports around the Eastern Mediterranean, the Aegean, and Asia Minor. These cities had everything expelled Jews needed: established Jewish populations, commercial connections, and direct maritime access from Ostia. Before we can predict where expelled Jews went, we need to look at where Jewish communities already existed. This map shows established diaspora settlements across the empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries. CE, places with synagogues, infrastructure, and networks capable of absorbing large numbers of displaced people. And notice how many of these communities appear in the very cities Paul writes to or mentions directly in his letters: Thessalonica, Philippi, Corinth, Galatia, Rome, Colossae, Ephesus, Antioch, and Damascus. These are not random locations. They overlap precisely with the diaspora centers that could receive displaced Roman Jews. Now look at this map. These are the cities where Paul operated between 51 and 58 CE, based solely on his own letters, our earliest, most reliable sources: Corinth, Thessalonica, Philippi, Ephesus, Galatia. The same names. Every single one is a major port city or region close to one. Every single one has an established Jewish diaspora community. Every single one is on the maritime routes from Ostia. I want to emphasize, this is not from Acts. Acts is a late source, written 30 to 70 years after Paul's letters. This is from Paul's own correspondence, the earliest documents we have. These are the places Paul himself tells us he went and sent letters to, brought there by messengers with distinctly Roman names such as Gaius and Titus. In the case of one letter written by a scribe called Tertius, while visiting the home of Corinth's city treasurer, a Roman government official named Erastus. When you overlay these three maps, Roman maritime routes, Jewish diaspora population centers, and Paul's documented locations, they match almost perfectly. This isn't a coincidence we can dismiss. This is a pattern that requires explanation. Why would Paul's missionary activity, or perhaps we should say the activities of a man with a background as a persecutor, precisely follow the same routes and destinations we would predict for expelled Jews from Rome? The traditional explanation is that Paul went where there were Jews because he was evangelizing to Jews and God-fearers. But that doesn't explain the timing, or why these specific cities, or why the activity stops after 8 years. The intelligence framework explains all of it. These are exactly the cities Rome would need to monitor if they were tracking a displaced population involved in messianic unrest. And the monitoring stops the moment these Jews are allowed back in Rome, the moment that also marks the end of Paul's letter writing. This particular chronology is often overlooked in biblical studies, but in intelligence analysis, the operational timing is telling. 49. Messianic unrest in Rome, Jews expelled. This is documented by Suetonius, 49 to 50. Dispersal period. Maritime travel from Ostia to diaspora cities. 51. Paul's first letter, 1 Thessalonians. This is the earliest Christian document we have. 51 to 58. Paul's entire documented activity. All 7 undisputed letters fall within this 8-year window. After 58, complete silence. No more letters from Paul, This is an extraordinarily compressed timeline. Paul appears immediately after the expulsion, operates for exactly 8 years, then stops. In intelligence terms, this looks like a specific operational window, not a lifetime religious mission. Who exactly is this person appearing in the right places at the right time? In Paul's own letters, he claims Pharisaic background, which gives him religious credibility within Jewish communities. He's bilingual, writing fluently in Greek, though his Hebrew knowledge is questionable. Here's what we don't have: any verified origin story. We have no evidence of his presence in Jerusalem despite his claims. He writes no letters to Judea. The people around him, Aquila, Priscilla, Silvanus, Gaius, Tertius, Titus, all have Roman names. These may be Jews who have taken on Roman names, or they may, what they appear to be, Romans. And he admits to having persecuted the church violently. This isn't casual opposition. This is organized, systematic suppression that requires authority, resources, and institutional backing. This is the slide I want you to sit with for a moment. What gave Paul the authority to persecute the church violently? He's supposedly a Pharisee, a religious teacher. But Pharisees didn't have arrest powers. They didn't have the authority or training to organize systematic persecution across multiple locations. That requires either Roman or temple authorities. But these would have acted in the interest of Rome. If Paul had this level of operational capability before his supposed conversion, we need to ask, where did it come from? In any intelligence analysis, when someone has the capacity for organized violence, that's a question you don't skip. Let's look at what Paul actually taught, compared to traditional Jewish messianism. In the first century, Jewish messianic expectation was mostly political. The Messiah was expected to free Israel from foreign rule and restore the kingdom. You see this in parts of the Dead Sea Scrolls and in the broader revolutionary climate Josephus describes. Now look at Paul's message. It's not political at all, and in this context, that makes it very political. He teaches spiritual salvation, not liberation. He tells people to obey the authorities, Romans 13, pay taxes, and submit to Roman power. He also argues that Gentiles don't need to be circumcised or follow Jewish ritual law to join the movement. That opens what had been a more bounded Jewish community to outsiders, making it broader, more diffuse, and easier for Roman outsiders to monitor. And by sending his own messengers into diaspora communities, Paul effectively inserted much-needed eyes and ears on the ground. This is the opposite of revolutionary messianism, and it aligns perfectly with Roman security interests. If you're Rome and you're dealing with messianic unrest, this is exactly the kind of message you would want spreading. Here's something that should trouble anyone working with the traditional narrative. James and Peter, the leaders of the movement in Jerusalem, knew Jesus personally. Paul didn't. They were there from the beginning. Paul wasn't. They led the original community. These are the people with first-hand knowledge Paul did not possess. Yet Paul's letters reveal intense conflict between them. In Galatians, Paul is openly hostile to James's authority. James sends people to check on Paul's teaching. They oppose his message to diaspora communities. The traditional explanation is theological: Jewish Christianity versus Gentile Christianity, circumcision versus grace. But look at it geographically. Paul is operating in diaspora cities, targeting the exact communities where expelled Jews from Rome would have settled in this exact same time period. James sees Paul corrupting these communities with a message that serves Roman interests. This isn't a theological dispute. It's a territorial conflict over who gets to influence displaced Jews. This is where everything converges. 3 independent patterns, each one diagnostic on its own. Chronology. Paul appears immediately after the expulsion. 8 years of activity, then silence. This matches an operational time frame, not a religious movement's natural development. Geography. Paul systematically targets the cities where expelled Jews would have gone. He follows maritime routes from Ostia. He visits every major diaspora hub that received displaced populations. Strategy. His message transforms revolutionary messianism into spiritual submission. It explicitly serves Roman security interests. It removes political threat while maintaining religious continuity. Each pattern alone is suggestive. You could potentially explain one pattern away, but all three together. This is what we call diagnostic evidence. It points to a single explanation that makes all three patterns coherent. For those thinking this sounds implausible, let me give you modern examples of the exact same pattern. Afghanistan in the 1980s. The U.S. armed and trained Mujahideen fighters to resist the Soviet invasion. When the Soviets left, those fighters didn't disappear. They dispersed, creating networks that evolved into Al-Qaeda and other groups. Displacement without monitoring created a global security problem. Iraq, 2003. The U.S. disbanded the Iraqi army, putting thousands of trained soldiers on the street without jobs or oversight. Many became insurgent leaders. Again, displacement without monitoring created the conditions for ISIS. These are documented cases where state actions created dispersed security problems. Rome faced the exact same dynamic in 49 CE. They expelled large numbers of people, agitated by messianic ideas, creating a distributed network. The question isn't whether Rome could have responded, it's whether they would have ignored it. And everything we know about Roman security practice says they wouldn't. Before we conclude, I need to address methodology, because this is where biblical scholarship has a systematic problem. In intelligence analysis, we use the NATO Admiralty Code to rate sources. Sources get a rating A through F for reliability. Information gets a rating 1 through 6 for credibility. This is standard practice when you're dealing with sources of varying quality. Paul's letters, 51 to 58 CE. These are primary sources, written by Paul himself, contemporaneous with events. By any standard, these are our most reliable information, Acts. Written 80 to 120 CE, 30 to 70 years after Paul's letters. It's a secondary source that contradicts Paul on multiple points. It gives us the Damascus Road story, the Tarsus origin, the detailed conversion narrative, none of which Paul himself ever describes. Here's the critical rule. Later, lower-rated sources cannot be used to interpret earlier, higher-rated ones. You don't use a second-century account to explain what a first-century letter means, especially not when you don't know who wrote it or why, and if it contradicts the earlier source in various places. But that's exactly what biblical scholarship does. The entire traditional story depends on reading Paul through the lens of Acts. When you bracket Acts and work only with Paul's letters, a very different picture emerges. In an earlier presentation on the History Valley podcast, I explained how Paul's actions align with the profile of a fake defector, a double agent, as outlined by James Olson, former head of CIA counterintelligence, in his book To Catch a Spy. Here is the first of 2 slides summarizing that alignment. Look at the red flags first. Low production of intelligence, frequent promises that lead to conflict, recurring excuses, fearlessness, despite supposedly betraying a violent organization, and a suspicious origin story with no witnesses. Paul raises nearly every single flag. Now look at the 10 typical objectives of a double agent, as described by James Olson. Spread disinformation. Paul redefined Messiah in a way that neutralized revolutionary hopes. Learn the opponent's methods. He embedded himself inside target communities. Identify hostile figures. He undermined James and Peter. Disrupt operations. The circumcision controversy fractured the movement. Handle finances with unclear accountability. Discredit leadership. Across the board, Paul's documented behavior aligns with all 10 objectives. This isn't me cherry-picking evidence to fit a theory. This is standard counterintelligence methodology applied to historical sources. And the pattern is diagnostic. So what does the intelligence operation hypothesis actually explain? Why does Paul's theology differ so radically from the Jerusalem leadership? Because he isn't developing the original teaching, he's transforming it to serve different interests. Why did Christianity become non-revolutionary? Because the version that survived and spread was Paul's version, not James's. A version that aligns with Roman strategic interests, coming from a man with a persecutor background. Why does Paul's activity match the destinations of the expelled Jewish population so precisely? Because that's who he was sent to monitor and influence. Why is the timeline so compressed? 8 years, then silence. Because this looks like an operation with specific objectives, not a lifelong religious mission. The traditional hypothesis struggles with each of these questions on its own. The intelligence hypothesis explains all of them with one coherent framework that requires fewer assumptions. And then there's the security investigation issue. Paul is a defector. As I explained in earlier work, including the History Valley podcast, every defector must have their sincerity assessed. That's not paranoia. That's standard counterintelligence practice. And in that context, the burden of proof is reversed. The investigator does not have to prove the defection was fake. The supposed defector has to prove it was real. He has to convince the counterintelligence team that he truly wants to defect, that he truly wants to work for his former enemy. And Paul raises many red flags. The most important one is also the simplest. A genuine defector shares sensitive information about his former side. When he doesn't, James Olson, former chief of counterintelligence, says the defector has a serious credibility problem. Paul's story is full of red flags like these, and when you combine them with the new pattern that emerges once we place the expulsion at the center of the story, his claims become very difficult to accept at face value. That's what good historical analysis does. It finds the explanation that accounts for the most evidence with the fewest unsupported assumptions. Let me be explicit about the comparison. Traditional hypothesis: Paul was a sincere religious convert, or defector, following a supernatural event on the Damascus Road. He devoted his life to spreading the gospel to Gentiles. This requires you to believe. A supernatural conversion actually occurred. Paul independently chose the exact cities where the expelled Jews went, guided by the Holy Spirit. The timing of his appearance immediately after the expulsion is coincidence. His message's alignment with Roman interests is coincidence. His conflict with James is purely theological. He just happens to repeatedly undermine the same people he once persecuted. His behavior reflects a personality that remains consistent, except now expressed through a religious disguise. That continuity is psychologically parsimonious, but it raises questions for the traditional view. Intelligence operation hypothesis: Rome responded to a documented security crisis by monitoring and influencing the displaced population. This requires you to believe. Rome acted in line with documented Roman security practices. Paul's locations match operational requirements. His message serves the interests we would expect. The timeline reflects a defined operational window. I'm not asking you to accept this hypothesis. I'm asking you to consider which explanation requires fewer leaps of faith, which is more consistent with what we know about Roman behavior, intelligence operations, and displaced populations. Which one explains more of the evidence? Here are a few important things the traditional framework cannot explain. First, there is no documentary evidence of Christianity before Paul's first letter in 51 CE. No Christian texts. Nothing. Paul's letters are the earliest Christian documents we possess. Second, the 17-year gap between his supposed conversion and his first letter exists only in Acts, a late source that contradicts Paul's own timeline. Third, the Chrestus disturbances in Rome occur in 49 CE. Paul begins writing about Christos in 51 CE. Same word, reversed timeline. Traditional scholarship treats them as unrelated. Fourth, why does everything stop? Paul's letters end around 58 CE. Acts ends abruptly with no resolution. The texts offer no explanation. The martyrdom story is later tradition, not documented evidence. Fifth, Paul claims he persecuted the church as a Pharisee, but Pharisees had no authority to persecute anyone. Traditional scholarship acknowledges this problem but has no solution. These aren't theological disagreements. These are evidentiary gaps that demand explanation. And the new framework, one that places the expelled Jews at the center of Paul's activity, does explain them. Let me be clear about what I'm claiming and what I'm not. I'm not claiming I've proven Paul was a Roman agent. I'm presenting a pattern that requires explanation. Here's what we actually observe. In 49 CE, Jews are expelled from Rome over the Chrestus disturbances. 2 years later, Paul begins writing about Christos. He travels to the very cities where expelled Jews would logically go, major ports directly accessible from Rome. His timeline matches the displacement period almost perfectly. His message serves Roman security interests: a pacifist Messiah, obedience to authorities. He moves freely across Roman territory, and his documented activity stops precisely when the restrictions end, after Claudius' death, when Jews are once again present under Nero. 3 independent patterns, chronological, geographic, strategic, all converge. If that convergence isn't a coordinated Roman response to a documented security crisis, then what is it? I'm not asking you to accept my explanation. I'm asking, what's yours? Because this pattern exists, it's documentable, it's undeniable, and it demands an explanation. Thank you for your attention. I'll explore this case in more detail in another presentation, available on my channel and on my website. This talk was meant to give you a first impression, a rough outline of the thesis. I want to close with something important. This framework requires me to let go of Operation Messiah 1.0, the hypothesis I developed over 20 years, published in a peer-reviewed journal, and defended in academic settings and on a podcast. That earlier version centered on Paul as a potential Roman agent, beginning his mission in Damascus and Judea. This version starts in Rome. It centers on the displacement pattern itself, something that hadn't occurred to me before, and something that cast the evidence in a very different light. The evidence led me here. And when evidence contradicts what you believed, you follow the evidence. What I'm asking for is methodological rigor. Treat Paul as an intelligence case first, a high-risk defector operating in a conflict environment, before treating him as a theological figure. Apply proper source evaluation. Examine patterns across chronology, geography, and strategy. I've used structured analytic techniques from Hoyer and Ferson's work for intelligence analysts, including analysis of competing hypotheses and deception detection frameworks. The pattern I've documented isn't speculation. It's structured analysis of the available evidence. I understand it can be difficult to reconsider long-held interpretations. I'm doing exactly that myself. But sometimes that's what the evidence requires. For the full analysis, visit operationmessiah.com. I welcome dissent. Thank you.